tonight, we're going to learn what to expect in 2020 from the current United States-North Korean relations. And that, too, is something that I know a lot of us have innumerable questions about, but that's the reason we invite someone like Dr. Peck to join us. We certainly look forward to her comments on what is, at the least, a bothersome relationship for the United States. Dr. Peck is a graduate of Colgate University, Phi Beta Kappa. She was a Fulbright scholar to Korea, and her PhD is from Columbia in United States history. I didn't ask her what the connection was between that and the rest of her career, but it doesn't hurt someone who does what she does, and all the time she spent in U.S. intelligence to have a firm grasp of the meanings within American history. Her time at she also taught at Hunter College for a couple of years, but she was for 9 or so years in the U.S. intelligence community, both in the CIA and national intelligence, during which time she did fascinating things. She wrote a lot of assessments, of course, some of which apparently are still being looked at and demanded. She wrote a lot of immediate evaluations, prepared briefing papers for the president, and represented national intelligence, meeting with White House officials on occasions, and held senior supervisory positions. So in short, her analyses were an important part of the development of American foreign policy toward Korea during that period of time. And now she's been at Brookings for the last 2 years, where she again is heading up their Korean studies efforts in the context of the East Asian considerations in general, specializing, as she does, with respect to national security questions and directly our relations with North Korea, but also with a view of the broader picture as well. So she comes to us as an interestingly seasoned authority, youthful as she is. So it's an enormous pleasure to present to you Dr. Jung H. Peck.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and I really love the energy in this room. Dr. Burt, thanks for inviting me to Baltimore to speak with this group, and thank you all for sharing your evening with me tonight. I really appreciate it. I'm very honored and flattered that you would come to hear me speak. I didn't know, I'm really interested in that Iran talk. I didn't realize you're doing this whole axis of evil thing in Baltimore. Maybe you should do Iraq at some point, I don't know. So thank you. I'm really proud to be a part of this conversation. I was at the CIA, they were grooming me, or they were prepping me to brief President Obama on North Korea issues, but I happened to be pregnant with my second child. So the way these things are is that you go through months and months of preparation, the schedule keeps shifting, I kept getting bigger and getting closer to the due date, and my colleagues at the agency had very, it was a source of great entertainment for them to, as I was going into my 8th month, my 9th month, right? That I would go into the Oval and say, Mr. President, can we make this quick because I gotta go. That never happened. So after all that preparation and all of the schedule changes, I gave birth, was on maternity leave, and somebody else did the briefing for me. Yes, but but I'm not here to tell you about all of my problems. Dr. Bird gave me thank you for that introduction. And all of those things sounds like a lot and really mixed, especially considering I'm only 25 years old. But at Colgate, I toyed with the idea of being an art history major because I thought I'd go into art history, do some sort of art advertising, and did 2 years as a paralegal in New York because that's where all my friends were, and I thought maybe law school. Professor at Colgate said that I have the talent to go into a history PhD program, and having zero guidance from anybody else, I said okay. So I went into Columbia because I wanted to study. So when you apply for these PhD programs in history, you apply to the school where you want to study. So it's kind of like an apprentice. So the professor I wanted to study with was Eric Foner because he was the #1 person on civil rights and Reconstruction. So naturally, I became a North Korea analyst and working on WMDs at the CIA. So I don't really, so all of those things kind of seem happenstance, but I think that, as Dr. Bird mentioned, that knowing U.S. history and knowing that history is not this linear struggle, and knowing how policy is made, and knowing some of the implications, and how those decisions in 1950 or 1974 or 1992, how they affect the present, it really informs the way I think about intelligence analysis, the way I think about national security issues now, and I think it gives me a fuller picture of an appreciation of the different perspectives, and having more empathy for all of the actors and all of the nuances in analysis. I think at the end of the day, maybe there will be some sort of thread when I look back on my career. Dr. Bird asked me to talk about North Korea today, one part of that axis of evil that is yet to be attacked. Let me start with this. I saw a colleague by the water coolers at Brookings. That's where I work now. Samantha, I ran into Samantha, and she was really complaining about how the gym is really crowded, and she realized it's because it's January and everybody's going, they have their New Year's resolutions, and January is a very full month at the gym. And so in January, we're talking about New Year's resolutions. People are going to the gym. They have, dry January where they don't drink for the month. But for Korea watchers, we're not doing that stuff. We're looking at Kim Jong-un's New Year's speech. And this year's New Year's speech was eagerly anticipated because in December he said he promised the U.S. a Christmas gift. Do you remember this? It already seems like it was like 6 months ago. He said, watch out for this Christmas gift. So everybody's on edge. What's going on? Well, and then Christmas came and went, and there was nothing. So people were waiting for the New Year's address to see, was he going to say something big? But there was no New Year's address this year. But there was an extraordinary, rare, unusual, unprecedented 4-day party plenum. That ran from the 28th through the 31st. At the end of that conference, at that party conclave, Kim Jong-un gave the 7-hour speech. Yes. Like tonight that I'll be delivering to you today. So he gave the 7-hour speech. But let me give you just a rundown of my key takeaways from that speech, and that was, I thought it was pretty underwhelming, right? Because Christmas gift, he said that the nuclear and ballistic missile test, the intercontinental ballistic missile test moratorium was over, and that he was not, he had no confidence in the U.S. anymore in negotiations. So anyway, the takeaways from that party plenum, what Kim Jong-un said was that he's never going to give up his nuclear weapons. He's developing new strategic weapons that he's going to show in the near future. He promised a, quote, shocking actual action. He told the party leaders and the military leaders to prepare for a prolonged struggle with the U.S., and said the negotiations were bad because the U.S. is only using negotiations and talks to try to bamboozle North Korea. He said he will never bargain on his nuclear weapons program. And he doubled down on Juche, which is the North Korea mantra of self-reliance. We're going to do all of this ourselves. But interestingly, he didn't say anything about Trump. I thought he might, but in the lead up to the end of the year, to this New Year's speech, he and some of his senior officials have been saying a lot of nasty things. They had been refraining last year in criticizing the U.S. president directly, but starting around October, the senior, very authoritative North Korean leaders would say nasty things about the U.S. president. So, you know, Bolton, whatever, he's human scum, degenerate, you know, physical defect. Bolton was that way. Pompeo was a gangster. You know, we're all used to that kind of language. But for Trump, they'd held back. They never mentioned the president's name until October. And so in October, I thought the real inflection point was when one of the senior officials said that we have given the U.S. president so much to brag about, and he has given us nothing in return. So that was the first time that the North Koreans started mentioning the president, the office. And after that, there are a few other criticisms about the president. But Kim, after the party plenum in January, on January 1st, did not say anything about the president. He said lots of stuff about the U.S., lots of stuff about negotiations, lots of stuff about nuclear weapons. And I think it's because that although that Kim doesn't expect very much from Trump, but that he's still at least maintaining that channel to have that flexibility. Makes complete sense. And what is the U.S. position on all of this as we're entering 2020? The U.S. president has said, for the past 2 years, we get along. Kim and I get along. Kim would never do that to me. He would never do this because we have a contract. We've met many times. He and I get along. None of the stuff that he says bothers me, etc. Secretary of State Pompeo said, when asked if the U.S. was going to continue with the status quo, he said, we're going to stick with our current path, which is the U.S. is going to continue to insist on FFVD, which is fully final verified denuclearization, while keeping pressure on sanctions, but also keeping the Trump-Kim dialogue channel open. And yesterday, a senior State Department official said that we are now in this patient diplomacy part now, which during the Obama period, it was called strategic patience. So there's a lot of patience involved in all of this. So I think based on Kim's refraining from attacking Trump directly, and the U.S. position at very high authoritative levels, that we're going to have the status quo. But status quo is pretty boring. But it's a remarkable development that there's been zero development after 2 years of unprecedented personal diplomacy between Kim Jong-un, who was in self-imposed isolation for the first 6 years of his rule, and the U.S. president. Before Trump met with Kim in June of 2018, there was no way that a sitting U.S. president was ever going to meet with the North Korean leader. So it looks like we're still going to have this this kind of drawn out, waiting for each other to make the first move. The U.S. is not going to bend on sanctions, even though Trump, by his own admission, has held back on 300 plus sanctions on North Korean entities and Chinese entities that are doing business with North Korea. And Kim is going to continue to do weapons testing. We're going to muddle through these negotiations. But with the 2020 speech that Kim made at the party conclave is that despite this 2 years of frenzied summitry, that the illusion of progress was just that, was illusion. Kim has not been cooperating for 2 years. But if you only look at the South Korean president's speeches and comments, the U.S. president's comments, and Kim's and others' comments, you would think that there was something going on. But in fact, I think we're worse off than when we started. While the U.S. and South Korea focused on Kim's pivot to diplomacy in 2018, in that 2018 New Year speech, he said, I'm going to mass produce nuclear weapons. Oh, and I'm also interested in going to the Olympics that were held in South Korea. So the Trump administration and the Moon administration in South Korea glommed onto that pivot to diplomacy to see if there was anything that we could get. And I think that we had to make sure that we did that. But Kim has been telling us that he's going to continue to develop nuclear weapons. So 2 years later, we have more fissile material. The intelligence community has and I think this is probably still true, is that the North continues to produce materials that they can put into a nuclear weapon. Since the Hanoi summit in February of 2019 fell apart, Kim has done 24 ballistic missile tests since May. Sanctions on North Korea have been loosened as a result. In fact, a former UN panel of experts, person who was on the panel of experts that was in charge of monitoring and reporting on North Korean sanctions, has said the title of her article is Rest in Peace, Maximum Pressure. The alliances and our allies have been marginalized. The personal extreme bilateralism of the Trump-Kim diplomacy, in effect, what that has done is that it has marginalized the South Korean president, it has marginalized the Japanese prime minister, and so their equities have had to be protected through Trump. And if you know anything about the president's approach to alliances, is that for the past 30 years he's been criticizing alliances, and this fissure in alliances is something that North Korea takes advantage of. Finally, China and Russia are filling in the seams, the gaps where U.S. leadership has failed. North Korea's weapons, since in the past 2 years, with all the testing and despite all the negotiations, are more reliable, they're more mobile, and more dangerous. Kim, instead of being chastened, he has been emboldened. Personal diplomacy with the president has given him cover for many things. As I mentioned, he's conducted 24 rounds of ballistic missile testing. These are shorter range ballistic missiles that can't reach the continental United States, but they can hit US bases in the Asia Pacific, as well as South Korea and Japan. And because they're shorter range and because of all the testing over the past decades, they're much more reliable. We've given him the go-ahead on human rights. You remember Otto Warmbier, student from Virginia, University of Virginia, who went to North Korea on a tour and came back in a coma. When asked about that, our president said that he asked Kim about it. Kim said he didn't know about it, that it was regretful, but that's the way it is. So we've given, and there used to be a human rights envoy that U.S. used to have. That position has been vacant for the past 3 years. And finally, it's given Kim legitimacy on the world stage. So despite the 3 intercontinental ballistic missile tests in 2017, 6 nuclear tests up to from 2006 to 2017, the fact that the sitting U.S. president was willing to meet gave him that gravitas that the North Korean leaders have been craving. So Kim, in his first 34 years of his life has accomplished something that his father and grandfather were never able to accomplish. In the past 2 years, Kim Jong-un has had 5 summits with the Chinese leader, 3 meetings with the U.S. president, 3 meetings with the South Korean president, and 1 meeting with Vladimir Putin, and 0 with Prime Minister Abe. So there have been very few costs on Kim for all of his bad actions. And North Korea seems poised for more provocative actions and weapons tests this year. Remember what I said about shocking actual action, and how North Korea will develop and test more these new strategic weapons that they have not specified what they are. The North Koreans have been developing a submarine launch ballistic weapon, as well as medium-range ballistic missiles that would put Guam in range. I think what we might see is a satellite launch. The North Koreans have used a space launch as a cover to test ICBM technologies. And we might see them in various military parades that are scheduled, or that are usually scheduled for February for his father's birthday, and in April for his grandfather's birthday. So the first mock-ups of the ICBMs that we saw that we knew North Korea was developing were paraded at one of these parades. So we might see something in next month or in April. So why does Kim think that he can keep pushing our buttons? Despite all of this, even with the satellite imagery showing us that the nuclear facilities and the ballistic missile facilities are in operation, South Korea still wants inter-Korean exchanges and wants to encourage inter-Korean economic cooperation. China and Russia, Kim has validated that China and Russia, despite all of this, has not abandoned North Korea. In fact, last month, Beijing and Moscow are cooperating they proposed a UN Security Council resolution to try to get rid of sanctions on North Korea. South Korea and Japan have been in a long-standing trade dispute, which got very bad over the past year or so. So our key allies in the region are split. The U.S. has been pummeling South Korea and later Japan about burden sharing, about host nation support for U.S. troops in Korea and in Japan. Right now, the South Korea and the U.S. are in special measures agreement negotiations on how much South Korea should pay for U.S. troops, despite the fact that South Korea pays more a bigger percentage of their GDP in their defense and pays more of the costs of U.S. troops than our European allies. And also, I think what factors into Kim's thinking about what he can do and can't do is the president's domestic situation. So I think that Kim, vis-a-vis President Trump, that he thinks that he's in a position of strength. There are no protests or Twitter in North Korea. The president is going through a lot of domestic problems. And also, the president is very personally invested in negotiations, in making sure that Kim doesn't do anything, specifically a nuclear test and an ICBM test. When North Korea started lobbing these shorter-range ballistic missiles, the president said, personally, I'm not bothered by these. You can imagine why Japan would be bothered by these, because they've overflown Japan's territory. But the president said, personally, I'm not worried about this. That wasn't in our contract. We only talked about ICBMs and nuclear tests. And so you can see where this would contribute to our allies and the regions and the European friends about what the U.S. might trade to save the U.S., but not come to the aid of our partners. But I think what this Trump's personal investment in negotiations and keeping Kim happy does is that it puts a big bullseye on Trump. Remember what I said earlier about what the North Korean senior official said? We've given the US president so much to brag about by not doing a nuclear test or an ICBM test since 2017. So I think what might happen, in addition to the status quo scenario, is, or what might break the status quo, is that I think it's not implausible that we're going to see another summit. Remember, the President Trump went to the DMZ in Korea back in June. He tweeted, "I'm in the neighborhood, I want to say hi," because he was in Korea for a summit with the South Korean president. And so the president went to the border, met Kim on the other side, becoming the first US president to be in North Korea proper. The president didn't mention nuclear issues at all. They talked for 53 minutes, and they didn't talk about denuclearization. But it was a way for the president to continue to keep Kim interested in continuing to talk. And I'm your friend. We can talk about these things. Don't do a long-range missile test or a nuclear test. The fact that President Trump in his campaign materials have said that he started denuclearizing North Korea. It's made it into the campaign speeches where Kim has not done a nuclear test or an ICBM test because of me. And so all of that is wrapped up into a high investment and a high vulnerability for the US president. So this is what I think could conceivably happen. And we're seeing some of this now. Because the North Koreans have already said that the nuclear test and the ICBM test moratorium they might not hold to it anymore. I think what we might see is movement by the nuclear test site or the long-range missile test sites, or some sort of camouflage or something that's not diagnostic of a nuclear test or an ICBM test, but would get people riled up enough that people get nervous about it. And this is something that over my career in intelligence is something that North Korea is very good at. The ambiguity, the power of ambiguity, the power of the fact that they know we're watching, so they move things around, trucks, camouflage netting, that we don't know what it is, but it looks bad, but it heightens tension, it manufactures tension in the region, designed to amplify their leverage against the U.S. and our allies. So I could see that happening, and having another summit or having some sort of other meeting between Kim and Trump, where Kim says, "Listen, Trump, Mr. President, I've done so much. I've not done this I've held true to what I said I wasn't going to do, which is not do nuclear testing or ICBM testing. But you have done very little in response. I have hardliners in my government who are going to force my hand and make me do something." For the record, there are no hardliners in North Korea. People don't, when it comes to the nuclear weapons and the decision making, it's Kim. But I can envision Kim saying something like this. Why? Because in August, he wrote Trump a 3-page letter that Trump said was a beautiful letter. He said it was single-spaced, went all the way from top to bottom. And in the letter, Kim apologized for all the short-range ballistic missile tests. And Trump was like, okay. He apologized. And so I think what that validates for Kim is that flattery and letters and personal diplomacy works to his advantage. And as a result of that summit, we could potentially see a bad deal, which is where we lift some sanctions because Kim hasn't done, Kim has fulfilled this moratorium on nuclear testing, but we lift sanctions. Once those sanctions go away, they're not going to come back in the absence of some highly provocative moves from North Korea. A second type of scenario is that we see, and not mutually exclusive, we see a slow buildup of tension. submarine launch ballistic missile testing, missile tests that fly over Japan again, because North Korea said, Japan, you should stop talking about denuclearization because we might shoot another missile over your territory. And we might see a medium-range ballistic missile test, or a space launch, or or movement toward an ICBM test. Or we could see a quick escalation where Kim says, these are my new strategic weapons, and does an ICBM test and just explodes, so to speak, the self-imposed moratorium on nuclear and intercontinental ballistic missile testing. But how would the US respond to something like that? You remember Fire and Fury of 2017? I think if something like that happened, there's no Fire and Fury 2.0. Because I think it would be much more dangerous, and this would be that Kim's confidence is such that we won't get to Fire and Fury. We'll have a miscalculation that spirals into a military conflict. Let me first explain why a military strike on North Korea would backfire. Every president considers this. And this was seriously under consideration with Trump back in 2017. And it's that if we do decide to attack North Korea without an imminent threat against the United States, that would reinforce what Kim's been saying all along. The US wants to kill us. That's why you need me. That's why we need the weapons. That's why we have to be aggressive. That would reinforce the regime's existing propaganda about why they need nuclear weapons. Let's say that we were able to decapitate Kim Jong-un. There's no reason to believe that anybody else in the North Korean society or in the leadership thinks that they should give up their nuclear weapons. In fact, it would just reinforce the regime's commitment to weapons. Given that this would be the first strike in North Korean territory since the Korean War of 1950 to 53, Kim is likely to respond. Kim's default is aggression and belligerence. And he's been spending many years advancing the capability to hit the United States and to have second strike capabilities. Kim might have up to 60 nuclear weapons, and as I mentioned before, his missiles are more reliable and more mobile. And he has a variety of ballistic missiles that could hit South Korea, hit Japan, and hit the United States. A strike would also, in the event that Kim responded, we could see up to 300,000 South Koreans dead within the first few days. So I drove about, it was 38 miles from DC to Baltimore. That's the distance between the thousands of artillery and Seoul with 25 million residents. It would create a humanitarian crisis that we've never seen before. Let's not forget that North Korea has probably the third largest stockpile of chemical and biological weapons after the United States and Russia. And they're willing to use it. They've provided chemical weapons to Syria and the accoutrements of chemical weapons usage to bad actors. Kim Jong-un used it against his brother in an airport in 2017. And combined with the artillery, the conventional military, the artillery strikes, the confusion, the downing of the communications infrastructure, and you add chemical and biological weapons into a densely packed city, you have disaster. You have a humanitarian disaster. The global economy would be in a tailspin. Asia is where our supply chains are. It's where most of the global economic growth is. And this would turn everything. And of course, China, Japan, and South Korea are the second, third, and 12th largest economies in the world. It would also throw a wedge into our alliances if we do it without concurrence from our allies, and that the U.S. is willing to create war. And of course, Senator Lindsey Graham did say 2 years ago, if people are going to die, they should die over there. So what should we do? I want to end on a positive note, Dr. Byrne. What should we do? So we should not let a good crisis go to waste. That's the number one rule in in security work, right? So I think in the meantime, North Korea can be unpredictable. But it's predictable in a very strategic way. Predictable strategically, unpredictable tactically. So we don't know if they're going to do a ballistic missile test next week or 2 months from now. But strategically, we know they're highly unlikely to give up their nuclear weapons. They're going to continue to evade sanctions. They're going to do all of these things. So our job now is to herd the cats. Shuttle diplomacy to say, are we all on the same page on where we are in negotiations? Talking to the Chinese, the Russians, the Japanese, and the South Koreans, and maintaining and strengthening U.S. leadership on these issues and gaining back the unity on how to deal with North Korea. Right now, everybody's all over the place because of the extreme bilateralism of the Trump-Kim diplomacy. South Korea and Japan, nothing brings together South Korea and Japan together better than a North Korea crisis. We're on shaky ground on South Korea-Japan ties, on the economic, but more importantly, from my perspective, the security side. There's a military intelligence sharing agreement that South Korea threatened to jettison last year, but now it's being held together. South Korea said it has the right to leave at any minute, at any point. But if in the event of North Korea's, we can use this time of North Korea ramping up their threats, any additional missile testing to try to get South Korea and Japan and to reinforce to South Korea and Japan that they need to cooperate, especially on these military intelligence matters. We can use the crises to rejuvenate sanctions. Sanctions they're not like jewels that you put away and they'll sparkle forever. They have a shelf life. And we can use that to designate the 300 plus entities that President Trump admitted that he held back on, to try to squeeze the North Koreans' regime's ability to make money that funds their weapons program. And we can use North Korea's belligerents to continue to try to convince the Chinese that it's in their interest to cooperate with Washington on denuclearization rather than having Beijing undermine the sanctions regime. Finally, I would try to revive human rights. We used to have a human rights envoy. We don't anymore. But let me go back to the speech that Kim made in the 7 hours on January 1st. He said for the first time, he came into office saying, one of his first speeches, he said, we will no longer have to tighten our belts. Referring to the economic deprivation and the hardships that the North Koreans suffered during his father's rule. With the end of the Cold War, all that Soviet money went away. The aid from the Soviet bloc went away. All their friends went away, either assassinated or overthrown. And there was a severe famine that killed up to 3% of the population in North Korea. But Kim Jong-un came in saying, no more of that. I'm going to have nuclear weapons and prosperity. But on January 1st, 2020, he said, we might have to tighten our belts, which is a big change. It's an admission that things are going to be hard. Prolonged struggle with the United States. It's all of our projects. It's our duty to steel ourselves against the United States. And if that means that some of our hard earnings go to the military, that's just the way it has to be done. But remember, I told you that he didn't give his New Year's speech. His New Year's speech is usually he stands in a podium, like a massive podium. Last year he did it in what looked like his office, but it's just him. And he would give this New Year's speech about how he met with all these, last year he said, I was so great last year because I had all these summits and, our standing is boosted, our productivity is up. But this year, I told you there was a party plenum. It's we, not I. We are telling you to tighten your belts, not I'm telling you to tighten your belts. So I think that's something that's missing in the analysis in the media right now, is that, so he didn't give his usual New Year's speech, but in a way, it was a way of diffusing the responsibility for the failures of the summits. And that brings me to the final point, is that Kim fears his people more than he fears the United States. And that our unwillingness to address human rights in North Korea as a national security issue, I think it really undermines denuclearization efforts. Let me explain. So I think that there's no way that we can have verification of whatever Kim says. So let's say he says, I'm going to stop making fissile material for nuclear weapons, but you're just going to have to take my word for it. That's not going to happen. We would want inspectors in to verify whatever he was doing. But in a highly repressive society where 3 generations of a family go into a labor camp, if you can't openly ask nuclear scientists, technicians, people who live in the neighborhood, who live in the area, who work in the transport, if you can't ask them questions and they would feel safe in answering your questions, answering the inspector's questions, then we have nothing to go on. North Korea funds its weapons program through human rights violations. There are up to 120,000 people who work in these prison labor camps, digging for coal, mining for gold, and other things that we know are contributing to the regime's revenue generation. North Korea sends tens of thousands of workers overseas to work in Russia in logging, African countries to work as doctors or monument builders, construction, fisheries in China or Southeast Asia, and they make money for the regime. They don't get to, they keep some of the money that they earn, but most of it goes toward the regime. That amounts to hundreds of millions of dollars for the regime that they can use, that they can use for their weapons programs. So putting all that together, we focus on the nuclear weapons and how to get rid of them, but I think we have to focus on how we weaken Kim's grip on his people. And I think sanctions play a part in that we're trying to tighten the regime's belt and stress and to create the perception of instability in the regime, that Kim decides to take into account what his people want and what his people need versus just pressure from us, because I don't think that's going to get us anywhere. In any case, so my positive message is don't let a good crisis go to waste. We could be in for very tense times in 2020, but let's take that as an opportunity to get back to the basics and exercise that muscle memory of alliance building and U.S. leadership. Thank you. So we have about 25 minutes for Q&A, so I welcome your questions on anything. So let me take, right here, gentleman up here. The question is Kim healthy? What if he dies? What's going to happen? That's a great question. Do you remember in 2014 he disappeared for four weeks or 6 weeks? Things went on as normal in the regime. And And my explanation for that was that institutions have memory. Institutions have muscle memory. And no one's going to rise up and say, hey, I have an idea. Let's do this. So Kim is not healthy. So if you look at some of the videos, so one of the good things about the summitry of the past 2 years is that you actually saw him, right? Without the soft filters of the propaganda machine in North Korea. So when he was walking down the steps, walking toward President Trump, he was noticeably he was heaving, just walking that short step. I don't know if you've noticed, but in the past 2 years, he's gotten bigger. And yes, there's a family history of heart disease, diabetes, and all of those things. The grandfather lived to 82. Father lived to 69. Father and grandfather were also big partiers. So, that's one of the big unknowns, right? Sometimes you can live a long time despite all of those, problems, or you could drop dead. In the event that he does, in the event that he dies suddenly, I think we're going to have to see another Kim. So there's a sister that he trusts, the younger sister, and an older brother, the one that he didn't kill. This is the full brother. So I think in that event that Kim Jong-un dies, that there has to be somebody from that line, the full family line, that is at least a figurehead for whichever regime officials coalesce to grab the reins. But so that is always a big unknown, and things that would be a game changer on a lot of these things. Thank you. Yes. The question is, what are these sanctions on North Korea? So North Korea has been sanctioned for decades. So for the most part, until 2016, sanctions on North Korea were for their missile and nuclear programs. So there's a lot of government hours and a lot of investigation to figure out which are the North Korean entities that are exporting, procuring nuclear materials or ballistic missile materials. So those people are sanctioned. Those entities are sanctioned. So these are UN and US sanctions to prevent the proliferation of sensitive technologies. In 2007, we learned that North Korea had built a nuclear reactor in Syria that the Israelis, got rid of. But a lot of the sanctions are for counter-proliferation, to prevent and slow the growth of their weapons programs. But in 2016, with the Obama administration, and that was carried on and ramped up with the Trump administration, there have been a slew of other sanctions called sectoral sanctions. And these are sanctions on the regime's export industries. So coal, seafood, textiles, wood, iron ore are all sanctioned. And we put a cap on how much crude oil they can get. And the idea behind that is that all of the money that the regime generates is fungible, and that they go into the weapons program. And so in Hanoi, when Kim wanted Trump to release sanctions, these were the ones that he asked for, the sectoral sanctions. So the counter-proliferation sanctions keep us safe. North Korea is, every now and then we'll see, back in 2014 or 2013, they were doing transporting missile parts to Cuba under 250,000 sacks of sugar, right? And they sell weapons and conventional arms and other sensitive technologies to where there's conflict. So they make money out of conflict. So there's that. But then the sectoral sanctions, those are the big money makers for North Korea, and so these are the sanctions that are squeezing the economy, hopefully.
So if they sell coal to somebody who's not supposed to buy it, what happens to the person who's not supposed to buy it?
So China buys the coal. So the question is, what happens if somebody buys coal? And this is why I say that the sanctions regime is withering. All of this depends on every country in the world, right? Wherever North Koreans are, they're not there because they want to buy tchotchkes from the local, souvenir shop. That they're there to make money. And so, but one of the problems with sanctions is that it's labor intensive to implement them, and you have to get the political will, especially of China, which is North Korea's #1 trading partner, to not do the things that they're doing. And that's why I mentioned the woman, the expert who was on the UN panel of experts that is supposed to be reporting on these things. She said, "Rest in peace, maximum pressure," because the appetite for sanctions among these countries has been significantly reduced because because their position is, well, the U.S. president says we have denuclearization. Why do we have to bust our chain to try to find one North Korea person who's selling this stuff, right? So I think there's a very sanctions are labor intensive. It requires U.S. credibility. It requires capacity building of countries that don't have the knowledge or the ability to check on all of these things. But I think that where it hurts the most is in our relationship with China. Beijing used to compartmentalize Taiwan, Hong Kong, trade, all those other stuff with North Korea, because they're also interested in denuclearizing North Korea. But what we've seen in the past couple of years with this obvious, what in DC we call the great power conflict, right? The open conflict between U.S. and China is that those two compartments are now one. So Beijing has been pretty lax in helping with the U.S. Don't count on us. You're beating us up on the trade issue. Why should we do this on North Korea? And that's where I said, don't let a good crisis go to waste. If North Korea starts to act up, this is yet another thing that we can bring to the Chinese and say, listen, this is what North Korea is doing. Let's get this going again. Yes, woman up there, yes. The question is, what is the status of South Korea and their potential to influence the outcomes either way? In May of 2017, President Moon Jae-in came to office in South Korea after year-plus-long candlelight protests against the conservative government of President Park Geun-hye, who was the daughter of a dictator during the authoritarian years of South Korea, and whose mother was murdered by North Koreans back in the 70s. So it's a really just convoluted history there. But progressive governments in South Korea typically want more autonomy from the U.S., and their focus is typically on inter-Korean engagement and cooperation with North Korea versus a hard line on North Korea. So President Moon continues to talk about doing tourism with North Korea, co-hosting the Olympics, going to the Olympics together, trying to do family reunions, trying to get the North Koreans to come to meetings. But North Korea has not only not picked up the phone when it rings, but they've said things in a very nasty way that South Korea, we don't need you. We don't need you to broker this. We don't need you to get in the middle of the U.S. North Korea thing. Stay in your lane. We don't need you. I have to say that in Kim's New Year's plenum address, he didn't mention South Korea at all. Usually there is always a mention of South Korea in every New Year's address. Whereas that inspires people to count words. What percentage of the speech was on South Korea? What does that mean for inter-Korean relations? There was zero mention of South Korea this year. And so that should speak to how President Moon and South Korea has been completely marginalized over the past 2 years. It's also because there's very little that President Moon can do on sanctions. He can't just say, okay, sanctions are gone and now inter-Korean economic engagement can happen. But the South Korean government currently is trying to increase tourism to North Korea, which is not sanctioned.
You have written elsewhere about Kim's interest in developing his economy, making it a tourist center. And then if one thinks in the longer range, and she's done a long study, of course, on the education of Kim. Given his education, what are the chances that he would see that as ameliorating the economic development in the country, ameliorating his hard, committed stance to nuclear deterrence?
The North Koreans have been focused on tourism for a long time. That's why they built dolphinariums and water parks and skate parks, riding clubs. They built restaurants. They have taxi cabs running all around town, department stores. What else? Lots of things. So let's talk about tourism. So tourism, when you go somewhere, you kind of stay in the resort. And North Korea has made sure that all of the tourists are sheltered on an island hotel that is protected and guarded by their people. You can buy things from the North Koreans. You're welcome to spend your money in North Korea, but don't talk to people about democracy. Look what happened to Otto Warmbier. That should be a lesson to the tourists, right? Otto Warmbier apparently defaced a banner extolling the leaders. That got him beaten and into a coma, and he died. But people still go to North Korea for. When I talk to people who go to North Korea because of its extreme tourism or this fascination with North Korea, is that they spend lots of money. They spend things like, one media report said that for a European to go to North Korea, they have to spend 5,000 euros. So what does that 5,000 euros do for the regime? Once you're in there, let's say you want a souvenir, so you say to your cab driver, hey, how much for that penny, that North Korean penny? Oh, it's $100, right? This happens. People have told me that they've paid money for pennies, right? So I think tourism is this blind spot in terms of how in how we deal with North Korea. But it also but it's also a vulnerability. So the Chinese apparently sent hundreds of thousands of tourists into North Korea last year. But you know what happened when China was trying to punish South Korea in 2017 for the missile defense system? They told their tourists not to go. The tourism industry lost billions of dollars in South Korea. So Kim is not a dope. He knows that China can rein it back in. And so tourism, for the most part, it seems very benign, but I think you're going to see some back and forth on that, and with Kim recognizing that there are some dangers to that.
Well, this has been a privilege. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your questions.